My house is not haunted, despite what the majority of my neighbors, friends, and the residents of the town where I live will claim. To be honest, they say these things because the last 3 families to occupy this house all passed away under circumstances that were concerning. In the first, a middle-aged couple and their 2 kids were shot by the woman before she shot herself. A young couple who killed themselves jointly came next. The third was a couple of retirees who were discovered dead in their beds. Most people would be discouraged from ever residing in such a home by these few descriptions, but I think that everything can be rationally explained, including shifting shadows and bumps in the night. Maybe I ought to tell you a little backstory. My parents felt it was time for a move nearly a year ago, after I had lived in the same house for 17 years, or my entire life. After a few months and a number of dull McMansions, we finally found this lovely house, which was only 90 minutes away from our existing residence. Each home on the little street had a distinct charm and style from its neighbors. Perhaps the most notable house on the block was this one, a level over every other home. It was a lovely little brick mansion built nearly 8 decades ago. My parents, my 2 younger sisters, and I were all certain that this was the property after a quick tour with our agent. The kitchen maintained its rustic character while being equipped with all the latest appliances. The living room's main feature was a massive fireplace, which truly made me eager for winter. Additionally, my new bedroom was about twice as large as my previous one. We have been searching for a place like this. The realtor told my dad and I about the house's sad past while Marnie and Georgia played in the beautifully landscaped backyard. Like many other families who had seen it, my mother almost wrote the entire property off, which would account for its incredibly low prices. However, my father and I, who both think that everything can be explained logically, reassured my mother that ghosts don't exist and that this house was ideal despite its minor imperfections. In my opinion, unless we purchased a brand new home, we would be moving into someone else's past. At least in this case, we were aware of it. 3 weeks later, we moved in. Shortly after we moved in, I started school, and naturally, when I told people where I had relocated, they gasped and asked things like, "Have you not seen American Horror Story?" I would be leaving that place immediately. Or, "Are your folks crazy?" And sometimes, "You should just move and sell that place." Finding the oldest and most chatty neighbor was all that was required to learn some history about the house. It's hardly surprising that the first husband snapped and shot her spouse and children before meeting the same end. He was a cruel alcoholic who made poor investments, and his wife was always sporting a fresh bruise every 2 weeks. The young woman of the next marriage must have lost 4 pregnancies in the house and, according to my neighbor, had a cursed womb. After that, any marriage may have fallen into a deep sadness. Additionally, the 2 elderly individuals who passed away in their beds were both over 70 and had heart issues. According to the coroners who retrieved their remains, it was quite likely that one of them passed away while they were sleeping, and the other had a heart attack due to stress after learning of their deceased spouse. Due to unfortunate coincidences and the wild imaginations of those who have seen too many paranormal activity films, the house has suffered, but I guess I should give them credit because without them, we couldn't have afforded this home. After more than 6 months in the house, we haven't had any negative experiences. Since we moved here, I'm fairly certain that my family has been much closer and happier. Everything is fantastic. The ventilation system is nearly a century old, so there must be a lot of tiny crevices that a draft may get through when I hear what sounds like whispering in the middle of the night. When the alarm system starts to scream out of the blue, I am reminded of how easily my younger sisters forget things and frequently enter doors and windows without first making sure the system is armed. I mentally note to alert my father about possible rodents whenever I hear scratching in the attic above me. Additionally, I remind myself to quit putting my possessions so dangerously on the edge of surfaces when I wake up and discover them on the floor. I apologize if this seemed snobbish or maybe a little whining, but I simply wanted to let folks know that a few square feet with windows and brick walls cannot be haunted. It is merely a structure. When you hear a floorboards creak, don't let your imagination run wild. Anyway, I should probably leave now. How long the sleeping pills I hid in my family's dinner will linger is a mystery to me. When I start mutilating them, I don't want them to wake up. The gramophone abruptly began to play on its own, but the sound it was making wasn't music. We were the ones. Cassie, Tyler, and I were yelling, fighting, and yelling in fear about bruising and grabbing hands. Never in our lives had we said those words. After exchanging glances, the three of us came to the same conclusion. Leave this place as soon as possible. Before we reached the door on the opposite side of the room, I felt my ears would bleed from the gramophone's constant increase in volume, but once we passed it, the noise stopped entirely and all the lights went out. Too afraid to speak, we leaned against the door and shut it behind us. After glancing around at our location, Tyler began to remark something about how perhaps it was all part of the play, but the words escaped his lips. The kitchen was filthy and dark. If the room we left had been from the previous century, this one was reminiscent of the 1970s. Puke yellow linoleum, pea green walls, and dark wood cabinets. The unavoidable, persistent feeling that we weren't supposed to be there, as if someone were guiding us into its trap, was the sole similarity between the two. Pursuing us, the basketball I was playing with as a child once rolled beneath a neighbor's porch. Without thinking, I followed it in crawling in, and something growled behind me as I felt around in the dank, cobwebby darkness. I never found out if it was a mountain lion, a stray dog, or maybe just a rabid raccoon, but I never had that type of fear again until I entered that filthy little kitchen, feeling as though I had locked myself inside with a terrible and hungry creature. There was only one door and no windows. If that was the case, we were forced to continue moving farther within the house. There was a problem with the atmosphere. It appeared to be moving, and I didn't know what it was until we got close to the dripping faucet. Thousands of small flies were swarming in the air. Cassie clamped a hand over her mouth and leaned over the sink to see what they were coming from. Then she groaned and bolted for the door. I followed Tyler, who slipped in a pool of something sticky and rust-colored that was flowing from the refrigerator. Somehow, our footsteps had awakened the place. A bang came from inside the cabinets, followed by another so loud that they trembled, and I knew that I could not bear to witness whatever was about to emerge from there. Just in time, we pushed each other through the door. I heard a slam as something struck it from behind. It held, even though more arrived, with enough force to rattle the door on its hinges. It appeared that we were in a children's nursery. The walls were painted with bright, smiling zoo animals. Simple white sheets cover a little bed, a night light shaped like a plastic moon with a smile. The room seemed to be waiting for us in complete silence, but then, suddenly, 4 nearly human-like forms sat up under the covers. We froze, too terrified to move. Then something attempted to drag me under by reaching out from under the bed. I kicked it off, yelled in agony, and fled. I discovered a burn mark in the shape of a little hand with too many fingers when I rolled up the cuff of my jeans after the door had been pushed shut behind us. The touch was still excruciatingly chilly. Cassie began screaming and begging to be released, saying that we had never consented to being touched by anyone, but she broke off in the middle of her statement. When we first entered this nightmare, we heard the same dispute on the phonograph. We were stunned into silence by the realization, and at last we started to notice our surroundings. We were in yet another corridor, but this one had no end. In both directions, the dingy yellow wallpaper and antiquated doors continued indefinitely. I felt like the corridor would tilt at any moment, and I would slide down the carpet into the abyss just by staring at it, making me want to cling to the floor. The doorknob of the room we had left started to turn while I was still attempting to understand it. Fingers felt around the hinges and gaps, and there was rustling on the opposite side. Tyler started tugging on one doorknob after another, but they were all locked. We found it difficult to keep up with him at the speed he was traveling. Instead, he began knocking, declaring that he could hear voices and movement outside the doors. He screamed and begged to be allowed inside. He then received his wish when Cassie and I were unable to assist him due to our distance. Tyler's door opened in front of him, and for a brief moment I could see the fear on his face before he was drawn in. The door shut and locked itself behind him, but Cassie and I weren't going to let that stop us. I kicked the door until my foot went through it, and then I howled in pain. There was nothing but a wall on the other side. Tyler felt as though the house had engulfed him. Even worse, we had no idea where we were. The doors were all identical, and none of us had bothered to mark the spot that we'd started from. Cassie just shut down, clutching her head in her hands and moaning about how this couldn't be happening. I recall thinking that if things continued this way, we would soon both lose our minds, and perhaps that was the intention. Then I heard the cracking of hinges. The door was ajar by the time I turned around. At first, my initial impression was that the opposite side was completely dark, but as I approached, I noticed the stairs, narrow, uneven, and without a guardrail, with a tumble into the darkness on either side. Have I ever mentioned my fear of heights? I was unable to do it. Cassie wouldn't accept no when I informed her that I would starve to death in the never-ending hallway before forcing myself to descend there. Through a mix of pleading, insults, and holding my hand, she finally got me moving, even though I had to crawl backwards to do it. Those steep, jagged stairs were composed of something slippery and cold as ice. A black wind swept around us as we slid downhill. It seemed like being on the edge of a mountaintop, even though I knew it was impossible. We were still indoors, weren't we? Conversely, perhaps we hadn't visited that inexpensive haunted house in a while. Perhaps we had been absorbed by another location. The stairs quickly became so narrow and high that it felt almost like you were on a ladder over nothing. It should come as no surprise that I slipped because I was so tense that I began to shake. Unable to hold on to the narrow steps, I slid down, knowing that I may drop into the emptiness on either side at any moment. Cassie, however, caught me. Just like the shouting we had heard on the phonograph earlier that evening, things transpired precisely as I had imagined. But what about the long-dead mannequin that had resembled Cassie tumbling into voids? Even though I felt it was already too late, I clung to the nearly vertical steps and yelled my friend's name. She had lost her balance and gone over the brink by clutching me. It's likely that she didn't even have time to scream. What if the stairs had been a trap all along? Cassie had been certain that they were our exit. Ultimately, the home had opened the door to the darkness, not us. As fast as I could, I ascended the stars once more, and the hallway above was just as I had left it. Well, not quite. The sounds of passing automobiles, the hum of a heating system, and the adolescent who had stolen our tickets, yelling that I wasn't meant to be back there and that the haunted house was closed anyhow, were present on either side of it. Naturally, I made a police report, and it was a very good one. They concluded that my pals and I were junkies on a horrible trip when I told them what had transpired. They later spread the rumor that I had killed them personally and that we were part of a satanic cult. I suppose they simply concluded that the situation was too odd and complex to deal with in the end. Cassie's father drank himself to death before Christmas, and Tyler's family moved away without telling anyone. According to the neighbors, he would shout her name at night as if he was unaware that she was gone. As you can see, it hasn't worked out, so I stayed put and tried my best to forget about it. As Frank was telling me his story, the sun had already set, and he appeared to be almost a ghost in the twilight darkness. I was at a loss for words. I muttered something about the porch growing cold and made my way to the screen door. Frank grinned and said, "I'm not asking you to believe everything you hear. Just swear to me that you will avoid haunted houses as long as you live under my roof." The screen door smashed that October night, and I can still remember it. But when he yelled after me, my foster father's voice was much louder. "Just where the hell do you boys think you're going?" I pointed to my friend Brett's car, which was sitting at the end of the gravel driveway over my shoulder. Over the rumble of the vehicle, I explained that I was going to a haunted house with several of my school buddies. "Over my corpse," shouted Frank. "Return up here." What I had done to infuriate Frank Little was beyond my comprehension. Though they were a little rough around the edges, he and my foster mother, Pam, weren't the exploiters or religious fanatics I had been afraid of when I was first placed in foster care. Thus far, they had shown me nothing but kindness, but my foster father's expression indicated that I was going to be treated differently. I was terrified of what would happen if my new family rejected me, not of Frank Liddell. Avoiding the other type of foster home was worth the sacrifice of a spooky house. At Brett, I shook my head. My expectations of fitting in at my new school were dashed when he rolled his eyes and sped out in a cloud of exhaust fumes. I'd be regarded as the loser who didn't celebrate Halloween from now on. When I saw my foster father up close, all of my annoyance vanished, even though I dragged my feet on the way back to the porch. He was observing me with the pale, shell-shocked face of a guy who had just barely escaped a horrific disaster. He had fallen, not sat, on the rocker next to the door. "Have you ever been to one of those events?" he inquired. "You mean a haunted house?" I gave a head shake. I was really excited to go because of that. They now have a wide variety. Monsters that are mechanical, ones where mask-wearing individuals might leap out and seize you. You must sign a waiver at some of them stating that they are not liable for anything they do to you. Are you certain you want to visit a location like that? Although I hadn't considered it, I didn't believe that the little small town's eerie attractions were renowned for their extravagant terror. The place was kid-friendly, according to the bright orange flyer I had found. Of course, most places just put out those warnings for show, Frank continued. If they were ever truly in business in the first place, they would be out of business quickly if they ever did harm someone. Surely, you can never be certain of the identity of those cloaked individuals, the people you've let to enter the dark, touch you, and possibly even take you somewhere. Indeed, it could simply be a poorly compensated performer wearing a plastic outfit. But are you truly certain? I had previously heard similar myths over campfires about costumed serial killers who sneaked into Halloween events to hunt down their victims. I had never given them much thought, but Frank's expression convinced me to change my mind. I'm not merely referring to a few psychopaths here. I want you to consider this. Why are there haunted houses? I gave a shrug. I had no idea where this strange talk was headed, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out at this moment. Frank wasn't finished, though. Do not assume that I do not see the appeal. Of course, if you return to the normal, sane environment you left behind after experiencing fear, it can be somewhat enjoyable. What if you don't, though? What if homes are the ones urging people inside rather than the other way around? I inhaled deeply. According to my foster father, buildings are capable of having personalities. I reassured myself that there were worse sorts of insanity, and I gazed longingly down the country road where Brett's car fumes were still present. I would have to make the most of my existence, since it was now mine. Counting my blessings, I whispered an apology and made my way to the door. But Frank's grasp encircled my wrist like a claw. Look, if you guys had gone to the town's haunted house tonight, I'm prepared to wager that nothing would have occurred. You know, people go to haunted houses all the time. For the most part, nothing happens to them. Would anyone notice the pattern, though, if it did? Imagine this. A police officer or academic would be fired if they proposed to look into haunted house disappearances. People turn their heads away, so it continues. Like a man slamming back a shot, Frank took a drink of water. And for the first time, I questioned if the water he usually had on hand was actually a replacement for another kind of bottle. Halloween wasn't always as huge and flamboyant as it is now. There were a few cardboard witches in the elementary school windows, a few hay bales and pumpkins in front of the town hall. And that was about it when I was your age. You had to travel to the large city if you wanted something upscale, like a costume party or a rubber mask. Frank let out a sigh. I should have stopped shouting at you. However, as soon as your friend pulled up in his vehicle, I remembered that Halloween night when I went on a drive with my two closest buddies and visited the first haunted house we had. There weren't many pals for Cassie and Tyler, nor did I. Even though that might have been the only similarity among the three of us, it was sufficient. Because Cassie's father was always drinking and getting into trouble, most people assumed that the apple didn't fall from the tree. For Tyler, however, well, the only thing people had against him was that his mother's skin tone was different from his father's. Frank blushed. When they led me into the little group, they had been dating for years, which is about as serious as it gets in high school. I have no idea why. Perhaps they were simply bored. In any case, I eventually began doing the kinds of things I had always thought teens did with Tyler and Cassie. Smoking in parks, strolling along railroad lines, swimming in summertime rivers, etc. And making arrangements for Halloween. The part that still hurts the most is that I came up with the idea for the haunted house. Everything was planned out. An appreciative author had sent Tyler's mother, who was the editor of a magazine, some pricey wine as a token of appreciation. After school, Cassie would leave the bottle out for her father, which Tyler would grab and deliver to her. He would be completely inebriated by 6 o'clock, at which point Cassie would take his keys and drive us out of town. We would travel to the city, visit a haunted house, try to enter some college parties covertly, and trick-or-treat like children. It seemed as though anything could happen, with the full moon rising and the autumn breeze blowing over our hair. Everything was prearranged for us. Frank shook his head and repeated, "We went to the haunted house after splurging on candy bars from the affluent districts and purchasing some ridiculous cheap masks. Cassie was worried that we wouldn't arrive before close, not to mention the line, because we hadn't kept track of the time. It was a struggle to find a parking spot amid all those cars, because none of us were accustomed to the metropolis. With its eerie lighting effects and menacing laughter, the home seemed to be taunting us. We headed down the sidewalk, hoping it wouldn't be too late, after Cassie parked the car in front of a fire hydrant. The ticket guy was a child our age, wearing a huge purple pinstriped suit and zombie face paint. He informed us that we were 3 minutes past the house's closing time, which was 30 minutes before midnight. He just wanted to get home and continue cleaning up, but I supposed the expressions on our faces convinced him otherwise. He drew aside the crimson velvet rope in front of the front porch stairs, collected our money, and sighed. The location had most likely originally been the estate of a wealthy farmer. There was something ravenous about the way it loomed over us as we entered. It was now rickety, emaciated, and gray. We entered a hallway that was only illuminated by eerie blue lighting as the double doors creaked open on their own. I thought that was a wonderful touch. When the doors slammed behind us, we all startled a little and chuckled at Tyler's quip about what appears in blacklight. The hallway Tyler, Cassie, and I walked down was empty save for plastic skeletons and fake cobwebs, but it must have been a pretty fancy house in its day. It had a depressing, empty appearance, as if the person who had built up the haunted house lacked the funds to furnish it appropriately. There were a few jack-o'-lanterns with candles flickering, and some speakers played Halloween-themed music, but that was about it. The three of us were somewhat dissatisfied because we had anticipated effects worthy of a motion picture, not cheap dreck that we could have purchased at the local dollar shop. A laughing woman with a rope around her neck descended from the ceiling just as we were about to reach the stairway at the far end of the hallway. We all shouted when the rope stopped her barely above our heads. It was obvious up close that we were merely staring at a witch-dressed mannequin. But that wasn't what had shocked me. You see, I thought I saw Cassie bone-thin and eyeless, as if she had been starving to death from prolonged fall. As the mannequin swung on its rope, Tyler shoved it and laughed. It didn't seem proper to break the silence in that way, so Cassie shushed him. All of the echoes were warped, as though the hallway was larger than it appeared. Everything went dark. As soon as I stepped onto the stairway's first step, I was falling all of a sudden, not down these steps, but others, steep ones that made me feel the wind as I plunged through the darkness. Cassie had me caught when I looked up. This was the dim lobby of a cheap, haunted house with no twisted stairs. I promised to hurry the other two to the second floor. It couldn't have taken that long, but by the time we reached the top, we were breathing heavily. Classic monsters were the theme up there. A mechanical zombie that sat up from its coffin as we passed, rubber bats leaping from the ceiling, and a mummy that emerged from a broom closet. Nothing like what had happened to me on those steps, nothing horrific enough to make us even glance twice. We were led to a door on the left by an arrow painted with fake blood, and Tyler wrenched it open angrily. We were already bored, anxious to finish this, and concerned about the automobile. But what we saw when we walked through that door made us stop. It was simply a typical living room, no tacky themes or decorations. Only a ticking wall clock in the shape of a cat with large eyes that swung from side to side, a phonograph, and a few couches. With the exception of its brand new appearance, it was an almost exact copy of how people must have lived over a century ago. As if the person who lived here would return at any moment. There was even a half-finished glass of brandy and a cigar smoldering in an ashtray. It was obscene. Like if we were intruding somewhere we shouldn't be and violating someone's privacy. Just as I was about to propose that we go back, the door banged and locked. It was difficult to take that initial step, even though I knew we had to cross that creepy chamber to get out. I got a terrible feeling that someone was watching us from the far corner of the room, and the little pink flowers on the disgusting wallpaper seemed to wriggle like small fingers. I've been asked a lot about how I started writing horror, and I've come to the conclusion that the best response is probably a narrative in and of itself. When I was younger, I had a lot of encounters with the unexplainable. I've always liked terrifying stories and devoured any permitted horror television. As I grew into a teenager and never saw anything frightful myself, this gradually turned into a subtle disappointment and a sense of betrayal. When we relocated, that was different. We had always resided close to the Appalachian Mountains on the East Coast. The land was hilly and heavily forested, and the mountains were blue on the horizon. I spent my childhood walking through the woods. The terrain was all rather civilized. That was just a way foothill cities were. The opposite was true in the Midwest. The best way to describe the American Midwest, at least in my area, is probably as a dichotomy. The suburbs were constructed in close quarters, with lovely streets and manicured lawns. At the same time, a fully unmanaged forest started directly outside the outer circle of houses, which were drawn around the area nearly like a wagon train circled for safety. That sudden back end of our neighborhood was referred to as the edge in our community. At 14, we thought we were too old to be afraid of anything, yet the abrupt contrast between the dark forest and the manicured society still captivated and frightened us. A mile or two back, there was a house as well. It was a well-known haunted place in the neighborhood, a holdover from some earlier time. Its main claim to fame was a peculiar sound that could only be heard within, aside from the alleged aura of great fear it exuded. We decided to go inside that house and unravel the riddle of that sound once and for all. I had recently moved and was attending a new school that I detested in the 7th grade. The other outcasts were my sole friends. There was Chris, who was always sardonic and obnoxious. Hans, the German child who spoke English with a heavy accent, and Caitlin, our token oddball, who allegedly picked her nose a lot and once ate it. Our gang was aptly referred to as beings, since each person participated in the maze game. Then there was me, too intelligent for my own good, just cool enough to realize how uncool I was, and more than a bit frustrated with life in general. Now that I think about it, I was every teenager in history. We weren't foolish enough to attempt it at night, so we slipped across the edge in the middle of the afternoon. The woodland itself was also different from where I used to live. This forest was more moderately tall and considerably more twisted than vast old-growth trees with lots of room underneath and a lovely carpet of leaves. A person could not simply stroll around in this. Even worse, for some ancient geological cause, Ohio was dotted with abrupt vertical canyons. If their exaggerations were to be believed, our parents would frequently tell us stories about the children who drowned, 1 or 2 per year. So, with double apprehension, we slipped through the tangled underbrush. The passage was so irritating that we could have made excuses and left for home once we got there, but we chose not to. This could have been our key to a certain level of fame. Situated at a strange angle, the home was encircled by dense vegetation and rather younger trees. The facade was bordered by 4 holly trees, 2 on each side of the main steps. The front door was open, and the porch appeared unsettlingly like a maw. For several minutes, we stared at one another, challenging one another to be the first, until a torrential downpour compelled us to hold hands. We looked for cover from the unexpected downpour on the porch. Chris said, looking up at the wall of rain that was streaming down from the roof of the home, "Yeah, that makes this way less scary." The sound of rain on leaves brought back memories of home, but the shadow that accompanied it made the dwelling much more gloomy. Nothing was visible when I looked in through the dusty front windows. Caitlin looked anxiously out another window. First, boys. Hans simply scowled before pushing the entrance door. Unexpectedly, it swung in silently and without opposition. The house's interior sat above and below a faint dust haze like 2 black planes. The entire place was breathing, creaking, and pattering from the rain outside. Back then, I was pretty verbose. "This is awful." The point was not contested. We moved slowly in, testing every foot, as though something may suddenly jump out at us. We froze, listening as Hans quietly swung the door shut once the 4 of us were inside. A river of sound washed over us as the rain ebbed and flowed. Upstairs, there was a squeak, and then there was a squeak next to the dusty couch in the room on our left. It nearly felt like a smart idea to bolt when on adrenaline. There it was before we decided to leave as a group. "It's similar to going to the movies," Caitlin muttered, "and the theater next to yours begins to tremble and rumble." The best way to describe it was what she described. In fact, a surge in the rumble actually dislodged dust from the rafters above, and the house vibrated a little. I scampered ahead, following the rumble, shaking my head to clear the dust from my hair. I came to a gaping black door at the sound, obviously the basement. Unfortunately, we gathered around the basement steps. The base of the steps was illuminated by a deeper shadow that came in via the little basement windows that we could see from outside. "After you," said Chris. I made a frown as I cautiously stepped down, examining every wooden board. Even though I couldn't see it, the structure itself appeared sturdy. I reassured myself that they could see my silhouette in the dim light of the basement and would seek assistance if they saw me fall. At the bottom of the stairs, I froze. Here the rumbling was more intense, like thunder in the distance. At every crescendo of the rolling murmur, I felt a slight tremor in my legs. Subconsciously, I was aware of all of that, but what I saw was what held me in place. Sandstorms of dusty light filtered through innumerable jagged things. There are 3 pitchforks there. Across from it is an ancient piece of harvesting equipment with a roll of bent spines. A bear trap on the wall, for crying out loud. Rusty shovels, machetes were hanging. Every piece of antiquated farm equipment in existence was scattered at odd angles. Someone took hold of my shoulder. How does it appear? Chris, leaning against the cobwebs we had gone through, inquired. He surveyed the area. Oh, Schneike! When Caitlin bumped into him, he sprang, and Hans followed. This seems risky, Caitlin remarked. I concurred. However, I detested everything about this city, even this place. As usual, I wasn't going to be put off by a spooky house, especially when the threat was so commonplace. I had always been disappointed when I wanted to be frightened and flee from a ghost. I said, we'll just be cautious, and continued. This is where the sound is closer. We know we're farther away than they've ever been, since no one has ever mentioned this basement. Concerned, Hans responded, let's go, take this discovery, it's already good for us. I gave him a sneer in return and shook my head before continuing on. As I moved, Caitlin walked past Chris and grabbed my shoulder. It has an ocean-like sound. Yes, it does, I said, unsure if that made a difference. A ragged set of tools fell from a decaying shelf, and I gently slid past it. However, there isn't any of that aura of fear that the other youngsters discuss, just this rusting mess of a basement. Hans and Chris followed the opposite side of the room and then cut through the center, navigating their own path through the vast, gloomy labyrinth of rusty peril. We all eventually arrived at the basement's end, where the noise level increased significantly. Hans held up a hand and said, "Wait!" He prodded out at the floor after removing a bar from something on a nearby post. Suddenly, it slid away, leaving a gap in the disintegrating rock and soil of 3 or 4 feet. Invisible in the dark, the gap had already existed, albeit a little less large. We could hardly see rain-filtered light below, now that the edge was falling away, and we could see little rivulets of precipitation rushing down what appeared to be a 100-foot spillway. "It's a cut-through to the gorge," I said out loud as I mentally went over the layout of the surrounding terrain. "That's the sound. The river is coming." "You believe that the deceased child fell into the river from this location?" Chris chuckled as he asked. I peered as closely as I could down the hole. With its uneven surface, sharp dips, and rocks, the sheer spillway appeared incredibly deadly. "Yes, dude, he may have. Died in the fall and was subsequently completely wiped off by rain." Chris became quiet at the thought. Caitlin tightened her hold on my shoulder. "Come on, guys, we've done it. Let's leave now." I took a stance to speak up, and I felt a wave of horror come over me. As though I were suddenly in danger, my heart started to race, and I sensed a summons to action. Caitlin's hold on my shoulder tightened and hurt. "What is that?" With a trembling voice, Hans inquired. I knew what it was. The atmosphere of terror the other children insisted was genuine, and I wasn't afraid of anything. There had been no prompt, no frightening sight, and no frightening sound. I kept the others back and looked through the dark haze, struggling not to run for dread of the basement's labyrinth of rusted blades and points. "Dara, do you guys see anything?" With labored breathing, I inquired. The panic was getting closer and closer as the anxiety continued to grow. "No," Chris said, frightened. My body was constantly warning me that something was coming and that I was going to be attacked, but I couldn't see anything. I experienced an odd moment of excitement beneath the wave of anxiety. This is what I had desired. I had desired to feel fear. I'd closed my eyes, feeling excited and in opposition, allowing the fear to grow enormously. I even briefly grinned. Bewildered, I opened my eyes. When I closed my eyes once more, it was there. I opened my eyes. Once more, it vanished. Now that I was positive I was seeing the cause of the unexplained fear, I closed my eyes. I could only see it with my eyes closed, but I was unable to explain it. An awful apparition sprang up against the complete blackness of my own eyes. The only way to explain it would be as a flickering gray against black silhouette of monochromatic spectral lines. It appeared to flash and leap in place, its form moving constantly. The corpse image moved forward slowly and shamblingly, covered in gaping wounds and wearing ethereal shredded clothing. Its head was permanently leaned against its shoulder, and neck bones protruded from beneath it. When I opened my eyes, it was no longer visible. I estimated that it was approaching us from halfway across the basement. "Close your eyes, Jesus Christ," I muttered. The other 3 children all yelled, "No!" together. "Take action," I responded with a yell. They did, and I saw the breakdown of their tense control. Already, the unexplainable terror was nearly unbearable, but as they realized what was about to happen to us. Feeling insane, I said, "We have to leave." I had finally seen and experienced the extraordinary, and the horror seemed to override all other feelings. I was reduced to logic and a thumping heart. It will force us into a hole. For a minute, my friends were pulled back to reality by that threat. I told Chris and Hans to go in that direction, telling them to go around the rusted maze. Hans nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks, and they headed to the left. I went right after taking Caitlin.